Good evening, everyone. I am glad to see you all and happy to be back with you on this third night of talking about freeing Jesus. Um, when you come to the last of something, you kind of, what are we going to talk about? And I'm really glad that tonight I can share with you chapter 5, Jesus as the Way, which in some senses might have been the last chapter of the book. And so I'm going to talk about that and then make some comments about why I think this project is important, this idea of writing our spiritual memoirs of Jesus, as it were, as part of a pathway of healing. So let me just launch in. Last week, we talked about my experience within the evangelical subculture. And if you checked in a little bit earlier, you heard me give a mini history lesson on the use of the word evangelical. That subculture, the subculture shaped by Billy Graham and evangelical colleges, that was the world I was in mostly my 20s and my up to about the time I was 33. And so when I wrote about the chapters on Jesus as Savior and Jesus as Lord, that was the language that was most often used within the evangelicalism that I knew at that time to describe who Jesus was. At the end of last week, I pointed towards something that was happening within evangelicalism, and it begins to show up in chapter 4, and that is at the time, and chapter 4 ends around 1981. At that time, there was an argument, a real rift that was beginning to develop within evangelicalism between people who understood Jesus in terms of a sort of a justice Lord, a Lord who wanted to be with us here and had a dream for a changed world. And that changed world involved including people of many different sorts. And it also involved care for the earth itself. It involved compassion for the poor. It was a surprising kind of evangelicalism that a lot of people, I think, now forget ever existed. And the main places where that sort of evangelicalism still holds on, where it still exists, where you still hear its voice, is around Sojourners magazine, by and large. Jim Wallace, for many years, I think you could consider him to be almost like the Pope of progressive evangelicalism. And the work that he has done and people in the circles around Jim have done has been amazing work. And it really reflects the evangelicalism that I knew in California in the 1970s. So that begins to change with the growth of the moral majority. And my surprise when I was a young woman sitting in a classroom at an evangelical college in California, my surprise at someone like Jerry Falwell coming to the fore. I literally, and those of you who grew up in the South, you can laugh at me here. I literally had no idea that there was any such thing called the Southern Baptist Convention. And I had no sense of what a Baptist minister was like, except for the fairly liberal Baptist ministers I knew in Southern California. And so that whole world of sort of cultural Southern and evangelical sort of Baptist universe was a complete surprise to me. And to see it then become politicized in the late 1970s in such a way that it wasn't becoming politicized with Jimmy Carter, but instead with Jerry Falwell, was a shock. And that shock was a surprise in American culture more generally. I remember that the media did not know how to report on these changes. I remember that when people started using the word evangelical, reporters across the United States said, "What's that?" and really were scurrying around trying to understand where the moral majority even came from. So there began to be this rift, and it was around who Jesus was and what Jesus' lordship looked like. And Jerry Falwell and his friends had this idea that Jesus' lordship was a dominion over an ordered society where people were basically slotted in different hierarchies of how close or how far they were from God. Now, that was chapter 4. We talked about that in some pretty dramatic ways, I think, at the end of last week. In chapter 5, something happens, I think, that people don't necessarily expect in this book. And certainly people who know me now didn't understand how fully I had been part of the evangelical world. And so in chapter 5, the theme, the way, it's really based around a verse in Deuteronomy. And even though I don't write the verse in the chapter, the verse was in my mind while I was working on the chapter. And that is when God says to the people of Israel, "Today I lay before you 2 ways, a way that leads to death and a way that leads to life." And the invitation, of course, in Deuteronomy was for the people of Israel to choose to follow the way of life and to not go down the wrong path. So when I talk about Jesus as the way, I'm actually sort of echoing that Deuteronomy command in my mind by showing that there were 2 Jesuses in the 1980s. And there was a way of following Jesus that actually led not to life, but to death. And there was a way of following Jesus that led to a far more life-giving place. I did not know that when I was in my mid to late 20s. Instead, I just kept going on the path that was opening in front of me. And so I went to seminary after graduating from the Progressive Evangelical College in California. And my seminary was in Massachusetts, a place called Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. And I don't know what it is about me, but I have this tendency of landing in places where there are arguments and kind of witnessing arguments and learning through arguments of the sort of folks who are in leadership all around me. This was very true for, I think, most of my life before I was about 40. And so at Gordon Conwell, there was an argument, and their argument was between a Jesus who was a Lord of dominion over versus the kind of laid back, easygoing Jesus of the Jesus movement in the 1970s. I arrived at Gordon Conwell in 1982. And there were professors who were literally lined up on both sides of this argument. There were people who were mostly Pentecostals and sort of open mainliners who taught at an evangelical college, and they were the laid back justice types. And then there were people who were very, very, very rigid Calvinists, and they were not laid back. They instead had this idea, the salvation was, of course, only for the elect, because that's the core of Calvinism. And they also shared with the moral majority, not the sort of cultural moral majority of the American South, but theirs was a kind of political vision that was similar to the moral majorities in that you have have Jesus over a society, and that everyone in a society has to obey biblical law, whether or not you actually are a Christian or you are among the elect. But these Calvinists who I knew in seminary did this in a very, very intellectual way, that they quoted John Updike and Gerald Manley Hopkins poetry, and they were very well educated. They could quote Calvin chapter and verse, of course. And so it was this highly intellectualized version of evangelical Calvinism that I ran smack into after I got to seminary. And I was convinced. I I hate even saying that now. And in chapter 5, I actually do, in part of this chapter, apologize to the people that I knew at the time, because I think, people ask me, why was it that I stayed evangelical even after the sort of different pieces of it began falling apart. The part of it for me that was most compelling, and I think this is very important to understand. I came in the door of evangelicalism wanting to know Jesus, and I found Jesus, and I found this sort of, rowdy, sort of radical, very earthy Jesus. And I loved that Jesus. But eventually I got to be very hungry for a sense of order. And I know there are a lot of people here who will remember what the early kind of mid 1980s were like. Of course, we had political order being sort of restored, as it were, to a sort of 1950s vision by Ronald Reagan. And there was this kind of theological longing to sort of go back and pick up the pieces of things that people felt had fallen apart in the 1980s in churches. So if you think about the early 1980s being right after the time of, say, Jim Jones in religion and the People's Temple movement, I don't think that there has been a book or article written yet that talks about how important that was in sort of shifting the winds within particularly American evangelicalism, away from the sort of radically edged, powerful Jesus in community, toward an orderly church with lines of clear authority. Because when Jim Jones killed his hundreds of followers in Guyana, Jim Jones looked to most people just pretty much like a regular sort of evangelical pastor that came out of California at that time. He actually had an integrated church, a church that was very involved in poverty ministries in San Francisco, a church that was at the front lines of certain kinds of justice work among gay people. And that church was a community where people, gave up their property and came to live, and created a sort of a Book of Acts kind of moment. And it was out of that tons of people who were actually evangelicals in the 1970s joined the People's Temple, believing that it was like the perfect church. I knew people who were part of that church from my college, from Westmont College. I knew people who went there from Wheaton College. It was almost like the best example of all of the things that we hoped and dreamed for in 1970s radical evangelicalism. And then, of course, they moved the whole thing lock, stock, and barrel down to South America, and it just becomes a huge, personality, cultic-driven, authoritarian mess where Jim Jones controls people to the point of killing them. Well, that became an example almost within evangelicalism. It's like, well, see, if you aren't part of the tradition, if you don't have the right kind of authorities, if you don't have an orderly sense of community that's tied into an appropriate church, you're going to wind up like that. And the shift from that charismatic kind of church toward this neo-Calvinist rage for order was so fast in evangelicalism in the early 1980s, it was almost head spinning. And if you think about sort of the thing that was also going on around us, is that was the time, probably in most of our lifetimes, other than the Cuban Missile Crisis, that the United States was closest to literally blowing up the world. And we all felt that. I certainly felt it in 1983, 1984. You pick up the newspaper on any given day and you weren't sure if there was going to be a newspaper tomorrow, because you didn't know if there was going to be a world tomorrow. And so that sense of chaos all around us, and then that sense within evangelicalism of this is what happens if you take this radical Jesus too far, combined to sort of push me and really almost an entire generation of young evangelicals then who were in their 20s toward this kind of neo-authoritarian evangelicalism. And that's where I went. It was explainable, but it was also something that I don't blame on anyone, because these were choices that I made to follow this sort of Calvinist path. And I write about that in chapter 5 and where it took me, including to the fact that I married someone who believed the same things that I did about that kind of orderly Calvinism. That was my first marriage. And the further I got down this road of this kind of neo Calvinism, the more I realized that I was betraying myself. It was not me to sit around in conversations and hear people talk about why slavery was a positive theological and moral good. That really wasn't something that I agreed with. But nevertheless, I was in conversations like that. I literally sat in circles where people were talking about how we should restore American slavery. I literally heard conversations about people saying that we should take away the right of women to vote, because women should always just vote like their husbands. I listened to people talk about how we needed to take the Constitution and replace it with biblical law, and that if we did that, we would finally be able to control the sexual impulses of America that were sort of destroying the nation, including the stoning of gay people. And believe it or not, some of these people wanted the ability to put to death what they called incalcitrant sons. And that is, if you had a child that was disobedient to you, that literally that called for the death penalty. And so those were the kinds of people that I hung out with in seminary. And I felt my heart going from a big heart to increasingly constrained heart. And there I was going down this pathway, and I didn't know what to do because I was married. And this was the true church. And what would happen if I all of a sudden decided that I couldn't believe these things? Well, I sort of secretly stopped believing many of them, but secretly turning your back on something eventually usually comes out in public, and it did. And for me, going down this path became increasingly a path of self-abuse and a path of violence. Not that I went out and blew up the Capitol or anything like that, but it was a kind of verbal and theological and I think moral violence that I was committing against even my friends. And that anybody still liked me after this is just a miracle to me. I do have friends in my life who remember all of this and who are very grateful to see that I eventually came to my senses. So I went down that path, and I talk about that in this book, and it became for me a path of death. And when I got to a certain point with it, that literally I had been driven to the point of mental illness by Calvinism. And I think I wasn't the first person in history who would say that. There are actually very intriguing suggestions in devotional literature and spiritual journals, through especially in Puritan literature in particular, that women were often driven to the point of actual madness by living in a Calvinist universe. And so I think that I sort of became one of those, but it was within the context of late 20th century America. So that meant that I had to make a decision. What was I going to do? And this is really the reason I wanted to share with you so much tonight, because I know that there are people here who have had to make incredible decisions about the path they were on. When you are on the wrong path, you can, first of all, deny that the path is wrong. And you can say instead, oh, it's just me. I must not be doing it the right way. And so I can be a better Calvinist. I can be, I've got to go back to prayer, and I've got to figure out how to really do this so that it makes more sense. So you deny it, and then you put any blame for the awkwardness that you're feeling on yourself. So that's one thing you can do. The second thing you can do is to just, sort of go deeper into the belief system. And that is not just doing things that makes you a better Calvinist, but it's actually sort of plunging yourself into a system so far intellectually that you're thinking, oh, I must be missing something. And so you take on the system, you almost begin to embody the system at all of its deepest levels. And nothing, and this happened to many of my friends, nothing can penetrate the sort of theological wall that you build in order to protect yourself from thinking that you might be on the wrong path. And so you kind of, you dive in deeper, and then you literally build a tower around that. And so you can deny it, you can go deeper, or you can turn around and go back. And that's the choice that I eventually made, is that I realized all of that, going in that pathway, that way of death, if I went that way, I was going to stay there, and I was going to be really good at it. And that terrified me. And so I turned around and I started retracing my steps, not even ever knowing that there was legitimately another path. I mean, I sort of guessed that from my childhood experience and from those earlier years in evangelicalism. But when you're an adult and you turn around, you leave your friends, you eventually leave your first husband, you leave your educational sort of environments, you leave all the professional credentialing that you had, the connections. When you do that, what happens as a grown-up is that there is just basically nothing, but you don't feel anything except for risk. You feel how hard it is going to be. You are not sure that anything is on the other side, that there is another path, and you have to be incredibly, incredibly brave to make that journey. And I did. And I shared about how that happened, sort of the points along the way where I began to look and see things differently. And where I wound up was away from the path, the Jesus that led to death. Oh my God, I can't even saying that sentence, it almost kills me, because we don't talk in that kind of language. Jesus is always about life. But I can testify there are pathways of Jesus that lead to death. And I think that that's not really who Jesus is, but I think that we have done that to ourselves. We have created cultures and theologies that create a Jesus who becomes a violent Jesus. And so I had to find this other pathway, and I found a pathway that was a way of love. And that path was the path that I knew in the Sunday school classroom in my Methodist church when I was a little girl. It was the pathway that I knew as a child when I was first understanding the stories of Jesus, who was teaching me about the love of God and the love of neighbor. And it's even the pathway that I first found at Scottsdale Bible Church. Ironically enough, Scottsdale Bible opened the way to what became the wrong path. But when I was on it, it seemed like the right path at those very early stages. And it was even the right path when I was a student in college. And what happened is that the path just became incredibly dark. I do think that the changes of the late 70s and the early 80s, and the level of fear that emerged culturally shifted something in the psyche of many people who were on that path. And it became an entirely different kind of path. So that is, in some senses, I think the narrative climax of the book. There are people who have read it in the last couple of weeks who have gotten a hold of me. And literally, there's this one letter that I got from someone who said that they read that chapter and they sat on the edge of their chair the entire time. And they also said, since I've read your other books, I knew you were going to get out, but I was terrified for you. And then they went on to tell me some of their story. I think that there are a lot of people in our culture who are in this kind of place now, with sort of different political and social issues that have caused all of this to happen. But nevertheless, I think that this is a kind of a shared story about the wrong way and the right way. The right way I stumbled into through a church called Trinity Episcopal Church in Santa Barbara, California, and by getting kicked out of the evangelical college because clearly I was in turmoil, and I hid it pretty well. But not well enough that the people I worked with in my department didn't realize that I wasn't quite on board with the evangelical game plan, and they had to figure out some way of showing me the door, and so they did. And Trinity opened a different door, and it was through that door that I began to find my way. And that's actually Ed and I became friends as I was moving off that one path onto a different path. And so many of the people who become hugely influential in my life are folks that I met right at that juncture. And the path is the way of love. I use the labyrinth to describe that. Chapter 6 then really becomes a coda to that turning around, because I knew I couldn't really end with chapter 5 because people would ask me, well, what about now? Where are you now? And where does the way of love lead? And so I share in chapter 6 in less chronological and more impressionistic ways where it led for me. And that is toward the idea that Jesus is present with us in our lives, and that presence isn't something that's just mystical, or and I don't think mystical is a bad word, but it's kind of ethereal or sort of flaky or inaccessible. But I talk about the presence of Jesus in birth, in motherhood, in our bodies, while we're sitting on porch swings in our houses in Memphis, Tennessee, in the sort of daily parts of our lives, and then also in the sort of dramatic moments of shattering that occur in our lives. And I use a story at Ghost Ranch to talk about being in what it was essentially an earthquake, and that Jesus was in the earthquake too. And so I use those impressionistic stories to talk about where the way of love has led. And finally, the last story in the book is me sitting on a stage at the world's parliament of religions, where I'm one of only two women who are representing Christianity on the stage of 20 women who are in every world religion you can possibly imagine. And there at the world's parliament of religions, we're giving these sort of mini keynote addresses to welcome the women to the world's parliament. And I shared a story about the power when women claim their stories as their own, and how that becomes a part of the transformation of religious traditions, and also is the transformation of our world. And so the way of love took me there. And I think that moment in some ways is the most illustrative moment of my recent life. That particular event took place in 2015. And so that really is the book. It's a book about knowing Jesus, and then knowing Jesus differently, and finding Jesus in sort of different places along the journey, and having come to a crisis where you make a wrong turn and you have to go back and pick up the pieces. And so all in all, the book invites us, I hope, to interrogate our own lives, to do a sort of life examine of how we imagine, and that word examine comes from the Jesuit tradition. That is to go back and review a day. But what I did is I went back and I reviewed my life, and to go back and review our lives and see where God was present and where we made wrong turns, and to be able at the end of that process of that review have gratitude for it all. Friend of mine, Kate Butler, she wrote a book a couple years ago called Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies I've Been Told. And I love that title because when I say I have gratitude for it all, I don't have gratitude for a lot of stuff in some ways that happened in chapter 5. Chapter 5 was just scary and harrowing at points. So I don't think that any of those things happened for a reason, but I do think they happened. And so my sort of twist on Kate's title is, not everything happens for a reason, but everything that happens matters. And that moment when after doing this life interrogation, and I could arrive at that point and saying everything that happens matters. And in that sense, I could be grateful for the whole of my life and not ashamed of bad choices that I made along the way, but that they happened and they matter in the making of who I am now. That became for me a real integrative moment. And I think I discovered a new wholeness and a new sense of compassion by writing this book. And so that's the project. And I can't wait to hear what you have to say.
Thanks, Dinah. So I've invited everybody to put into the chat any questions that you'd like for Dinah to address. While we're collecting those, Dinah, I would appreciate your talking about you're coming to a more integrative place that has forgiveness in it, etc., and that leads you to sit in a bigger circle. Could you address, those are some powerful things in your thinking.
Yeah, this whole idea of doing a life examine, I did not realize that's what I was doing when I wrote the book. I literally, as I had mentioned early on in our time together, I literally sat with 6 pieces of paper and asked myself, what are the memories of Jesus I have at this time, this time, this time, this time? And so when I went back and did that exercise and then wrote those memories in this book, I realized I had followed basically the format in my without knowing it of what is the Jesuit Examine. And the Jesuit Examine is a process that the Jesuits form for people to go through on a nightly basis, where you come to the end of the day, you review the day, and you give thanks for the day. And then you look at your day and you say, these are the things I think I did well. These are the things I think I did wrong. You ask for forgiveness for the things that were hurtful, and you re-articulate your gratitude for the gifts you have been given. And then you simply close the day in prayer, and you have a kind of a clarity on that day. And so that was really the process that I went through when I was doing my own memories, but doing it in these large chunks, not about the specific day, but about periods of my life, about actual decades. And I would go back and I looked at them and I said, oh my gosh, that's what happened. I tried to look at it as fairly as I could. What went wrong? What happened that was beautiful? Repent of what went wrong, or express sorrow over what went wrong, be grateful for what went right, and then sort of close the chapter on that time. So I learned a lot. And I think that whole ability to look at my life in that way, to do that honest interrogation, really became a moment of integration for me. And I'm pretty sure that of the 86 people who are here tonight with us, you'll probably recognize that, maybe not necessarily as a Jesuit Examine, but there's a real way that the Jesuit Examine kind of mirrors, say, a 12-step process. you take an honest assessment of your life, and you look at who you've hurt and what you've done right, and you fix what was wrong, and you offer gratitude for what was a gift. So anyone who's done any of those kinds of bits of work know that that results in a kind of personal integration. So I think that Ed's back. I'm not sure. He disappeared for a moment, but I did see, he told me to just, oh, there he goes. Can you talk, Ed, or are you back?
And Elizabeth, you to over if I get bumped off again. Is that okay, Elizabeth?
I gotcha.
Oh, there she is.
So
Okay.
There's some, yeah, great question, Anna. One is about women in this whole process that's powerful for young women who are influenced by Tyrian. If you that, and about third, and another question about how long did it go through that lost time? Address all of that. I'm here until I'm not.
I saw the question. I'm looking through the chat. I did see the question about women, and when you were gone, Ed, I thought that's where I'm going to go to that question. So that you went there is really interesting. Yeah, that's what I was. I was a young woman, and I was influenced by the authoritarian model. You know, when I look back on that, I think about, you know, well, why in a million years would I ever want to do that? And for me, it took the pressure off. You know, if you're a young woman and you're trying to think ahead towards your career and what are you going to do about family and this, that, and the other thing, one of the most powerful tools within evangelicalism is that women don't have to make those decisions. You can allow someone else to make them for you. And that is, you get married, and so then your husband will give you direction. And you don't necessarily have to make your own career decisions. You don't have to decide to move to one place or the other, because those things will just happen because your husband has the main job. And so the pathway for women is always a pathway of marriage and family first, and primarily. Secondarily, within the kind of evangelicalism that I found compelling, women's intelligence was very valued. They wanted educated wives and mothers. They just wanted really well-educated women who were married to safely Orthodox men who gave birth to 5 or 6 children and became lawyers, doctors, religious studies professors, etc. You could never become a pastor because that was a role limited by this authority structure. But you could hold political, social, or legal authority, even educational authority, although that was always a little questionable in some of the circles. But the people I knew thought that women could get PhDs in literature and even religion. So the purpose then for women is to have godly female foot soldiers appropriately submitted to the men around them, who will become leaders of the culture. And if you are not thinking Amy Coney Barrett right now, you are not thinking. Because she's Catholic, but these ideas were not just present in sort of this evangelical Calvinism, but they also sort of formed themselves over in conservative Catholicism in some pretty interesting ways at just about the same time. And so you frequently do run into women who are in that world who just surprise the dickens out of you because they are highly credentialed, very high achieving women. And yet they understand themselves to be appropriately submitted to their husbands and to whatever ecclesial authorities are over them. And ultimately, they are still responsible, first of all, to their husbands and to those authorities. And so, yeah, young women do choose that path because it is actually kind of powerful. It's a powerful way of saying that Christian women can have both things, family and a high-powered career, and you can change the entire world while doing it. And yet it does relieve a certain amount of the more painful kind of decision making that we all face in Western culture, if you're middle class or upper middle class kind of person, and you need to think about career and all those kinds of things. So that's where it is, and a lot of young women find it very attractive.
Thanks, Diana. I've moved to Hope's library, so she and I are on the same device.
Oh, great.
So there was another question in there from Patty Williams about how long did it take you to go through that lost time? Do you want to address that, Diana?
I think I started getting lost after my first year in seminary, and that was in 82, 83. Yeah, that would be about it. I had a tragic love affair and was sort of feeling the sting of ended romance, and I didn't quite know what I was going to do when I got out of seminary, and these voices just started influencing me. And at seminary, and as I write in the book, it was also true that the best professors, and interestingly enough, in certain ways, the ones that were most supportive of women they wanted to create in that mold that I just talked about, were the most conservative men. And so if you wanted to get the best recommendations, if you wanted to sit in the best classes, if you wanted to show off and really, shine, you went that direction because you were trying to please them. And anybody who's ever read sort of different things about women's psychology, especially in their 20s, know that pleasing older male authorities is like the thing that white women just like cannot live without because of the way that our culture has trained us. And so that was all part of it. So that was about then, 82, 83, I would have been 23, 24 years old. And by the time it was about 7 years, I think, was the sort of most hardcore part of it. And it began kind of getting undermined after about 6 years. And I was out the door after 8 or 9 years. So there was the transition, no wonder I know liminality so well. There was this liminal period of about 3 or 4 years that sort of was the exit and the possibility of entry into a new place.
Thanks.
If you want to know what really got me,
Yep.
the thing that got me more than anything else, and everybody here, I've told this story to both Catherine Jefferds Schori and to Michael Curry. So they know this story. This is no surprise. This is no secret. The thing that really got me is that in the late 80s, when I was getting my PhD, I wasn't just picked up by these evangelical Calvinists, but there were a whole bunch of sort of evangelical types that were Episcopalians. And those folks, they found me and they said, "Oh, look, she's our people." And I was like the only woman in this circle who was getting a PhD at that moment in history. And so they scooped me up and they started taking me to their conferences and inviting me to publish in their magazines and all this sort of stuff. And what they loved is they had found a woman who did not know whether or not she believed in women's ordination and who was definitely opposed to the ordination of gay people. And so they set me up as sort of part of being their voice.
Yeah.
And I never will forget sitting in a meeting at a church not very far away from Gordon Conwell, where this group of Episcopal priests and theologians were having a private event. They invited me to come, and they started talking about how they were going to use all of those people in Africa. They use some very unpleasant language to describe those people in Africa, to be able to control the future direction of the Episcopal Church. And when one of them said, because there is no liberal who will ever be able to talk back to a N-word.
Right. Yeah.
That was the very first crack in my loyalty to those people. I went, holy moly.
Yeah.
These folks are literally functionally talking about enslaving Black people to their political purpose in order to stop liberalism in the Episcopal Church. And I had I literally thought it was, at first I just thought it was that one guy and that he was just horrible. And yet I found out different than that.
Yeah. Well, Jesus talks about you judge a tree by the fruit it bears, and the fruit of meanness and mean-spiritedness in quote unquote orthodoxy is always, to me, a tip-off. And I know that they've still come after you on Twitter when you haven't been aligning yourself with the most orthodox thinking. Patty wanted to clarify that she really was talking about the time between your deciding to leave the judgment part to getting back to your Jesus. And let me pose that question, but also pose Averil's question, which is really a powerful one. Might this new path or new way be considered a path to the authentic empowered self? So let's pose both of those questions, and you could weave your answer to the both of them.
I'm not quite sure what the framework is that she's looking for.
Patty, yeah, I think she's just trying to see about the time between you're leaving that orthodox judging part of understanding the way to getting back to your Jesus, to the Jesus of your childhood.
Yeah, I think it was about 3 or 4 years. And I had written about that in a different book earlier in my career, a book called Strength for the Journey. And I write very substantially in that book about my direction, my relationship with a spiritual director in Santa Barbara, California, an Episcopal priest by the name of Michelle Woodhouse, and how my friendship with her really became the hinge between those two worlds. So it took 3 years, I would say.
And then to Averil's question, putting it in the language of your authentic empowered self. I was really struck, it hurt my stomach when you talked about, how you had to, it was do violence to yourself. I've forgotten your language, but you cut yourself off from yourself. And here she's talking about an integrated, authentic, empowered self. Is that what you're talking about? She's asking.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying, is that literally the irony of a chapter called Jesus is the Way is that the first half of the chapter I lost myself. I mean, I lost my way. I lost my sense of who I was. I lost my relationship with my own past. I literally, I think about it a lot. My husband, Richard, who I got married to in 1997, and he's my second and permanent husband.
Who is getting supper right now? I understand.
That's right. He's all fixing dinner right now. But Richard, who grew up in liberal Presbyterianism. I mean, you couldn't have two people with more different backgrounds than the pair of us. And so anyway, he refers to that part of my life as that cult you used to belong to. And I think that that's probably about the best darn description that anybody's ever come up with. Is that it really was like joining a cult.
Yeah.
And it cut me off from myself, and it tried to create me into someone that I could have been, I suppose, if I would have stayed on that road. But boy, the level of everything that went on, I mean, it was really tantamount to theological and spiritual brainwashing, I think, that I went through. And it was hard to get out.
Yeah.
It wasn't easy. And I do talk about that in chapter 5 with it opens. Chapter 5 opens with me in a therapist's office, and the therapist literally saying to me, well, the cage door is open, the prison door is open, just walk out. And me feeling this sense of fear that I couldn't walk out of the cage. And I think that is only the way you respond is if you have been sort of deeply traumatized.
Yeah.
By something that's holding you there. And so that was a lot of work. And I am infinitely thankful that I did it.
Yeah. There's a lot of emphasis about dying to yourself, which is not about dying
is.
to your true self.
That's
And
right.
it's about dying to your small self, to your separate self, to your hyper individualistic self. Do you want to say anything about that?
I think you just said it perfectly.
Okay. So Martha Esky wants to connect all of this to the national Christian movement, or the Christian nationalist movement that you spoke about in the forum. You want to connect the dots, please, for us there?
Well, I do think that there's a direct trajectory between the kind of evangelicalism that developed in the 1980s and what we see all around us now. Several amazing scholars have made cases for that around specific issues, everything from race and gender, and showing then how it sort of mutates into Republican politics. And if there are people here sitting in this circle who are Republicans, I was a Republican. I was actually, I think, a pretty sane Republican for a good portion of my life. And I know that there are and I know how much you're hurting right now. And you're hurting because this stuff basically has become the doctrine of the Republican Party, and people who weren't along for this ride kind of don't know how this happened. But there it is. It has happened. And essentially at this moment in time, at least, the Republican Party is very closely aligned with a kind of Christian nationalist movement, and they see each other as sort of, I think, co-inhabiting a very similar kind of space, or there's actual crossover where people are members of both. Mike Pence was member of both. I know that about Mike Pence. He's a Christian nationalist, and he is a GOP, and he was just vice president. And so there's a lot of really good scholarship on this, and not just the issue-oriented scholarship, but there's also a scholarship which talks about the actual theological connections between these movements in the 80s and where we are now. One of the best books is written by a professor from the University of North Florida. Her name is Julie Ingersoll, Ingersoll, Professor Julie Ingersoll. And she wrote a book called Building God's Kingdom. And she wrote it 8 years ago, maybe, before Trump. And you read it and you can say, oh my gosh, this stuff has been around much longer than just the last 4 years. And she traces it back to the late 70s and 80s. And interestingly enough, one line of this stuff comes out of California, where there was a hyper Calvinist reactive group of folks who hated the California evangelicalism that I knew. And they were mostly located around Santa Cruz, California. They formed a community, and then they become kind of the intellectual think tank for all of this.
Before we have our closing ritual, I do want to connect some dots to what you've been talking about. Your first visit with us in the forum, and the forum we had this past week, and the one that we will have this coming Sunday. When all of this shows up as hatred, there is a very important question to ask, and it has to do with hatred as addiction. And our guest last week talked about how he had to discover that his hatred really was an addiction and how that could be turned around. So I just wanted to make those connections. And the answer was unconditional compassion, which is what your book is all about.
Yeah, it's the funniest thing is, I can talk about, all the stuff about evangelicalism. And the truth of the matter is, if you look at the acknowledgements, one of the things in this book that has gotten the most comments by podcasters was when I write the gratitudes, I literally say a special word of thanks to Scottsdale Bible Church in Scottsdale, Arizona, Westmont College in Santa Barbara, California, and Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary in South Hamilton, Massachusetts. These communities shaped my faith life at important junctures of young adulthood. We came to have many disagreements, yet I bear you no ill will. I am grateful for the gifts you gave me when I most needed them, grateful that I've had to wrestle with all of our limitations and wounds, and I am grateful that you continue to give your unique gifts to the world. Jesus said, "Whoever is not against us is for us." I take those words seriously and consider that we are not enemies, but ultimately friends in Christ. I did not know when I wrote those words that those would become words that people would want to talk about on podcasts.
Yeah.
And literally people have said to me, I have no idea, after everything you wrote in all the other pages, how you could have a generous word towards those people. And I guess it's because I don't think of them as those people.
Yeah, exactly.
I just think of them as people. And I'm sorry, I can talk about the places I think they're wrong and the wrong theologies that they've embraced, but it doesn't make me hate them.
Right. Yeah, because that advances the polarization and the divisiveness.
Yeah.
And is the antithesis of the large circle that you're talking about. I do want to register that Neil Shorthouse has said that tonight was the first time he spent an awful lot of his life in evangelical circles. And it was the first time he had ever heard of any pro-slavery stuff, and was just wondering if that is extensive in your experience or a kind of a rare thing.
My experience that I write about, and certainly the people that I knew within evangelicalism, was sort of this, high level training of evangelical leaders and an awful lot of people who were involved in the neo-Calvinist angle of evangelicalism. And so I can imagine that one could go to a fairly regular non-denominational church for a really, really, really long time and never hear anything close to that. Just nice people who are trying to teach their kids the Bible, and they like the worship music. And so I think that it's really important when any of us talk about other people's religious views, that there's always a difference between what's going on in sort of the most elite circles,
yeah,
and what goes on in sort of the warp and woof of regular church life. And so I think there are divergences there. Although I do have friends that have written books on, my friend Anthea Butler, who just wrote a book called White Evangelical Racism. And she argues that even if you did that slavery, at least in theory, is just a part of the sort of white supremacy culture that is white evangelicalism. So she makes a different argument than I do.
Yeah. And Judith Smith is talking about the founding raison d'etre of Sewanee.
Oh, yeah, really.
So unfortunately, our time is up, and we're so grateful. I mean, this has been like 5 minutes. We're so grateful. Yeah, everybody's applauding and doing all of this. I hope you see it. But what we really want to do is put into the chat now a word of appreciation and or a word of regret, so that we can send this chat to Diana. So let's open the chat, and everybody have a few minutes, a word or two of gratitude, of appreciation, and or regret if you want to, or both. And then we'll have our closing prayer. So let's have some time for the chat stuff. Here it comes. Thank you very much for your appreciations and regrets. I hope you really do feel, Diana, that you have shifted the way we talk and the way we think at St. Luke's, and Friends of St. Luke's, who are from all over the world. So you're extremely impactful ministry. We thank you for being a part of the redemptive journey that we're on. So thank you.
Oh, well, I just really have loved sharing with you 3 weeks in a row. And thanks for creating a circle where I could be as honest as I am. And Ed knows and Hope knows that I'm always honest. and I've loved sharing. And I hope that you all see that I've had in a sense, a kind of a pretty normal 20th century, early 21st century life. And it has landed me in surprising place of a circle of kindness. And it's the best place to be.
Well, please consider us a part of your home and know that you can always be safe with us, Diana Butler Bass, and we really are grateful.